Good afternoon, Professor.
Hello, Hassan. Can you hear me?
Yep. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you guys.
Oh.
Here we go. You can hear me fine?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Anyone else out there? I see there we have a few participants, 6. I mean, it's optional, so we'll see who shows up. Before we get started, just a couple of things. The exam. Hassan, when's the exam for everyone?
It's in 2 days, May 12th at 1:30 p.m.
So 1:30 p.m. And it lasts until 3:30 p.m. So you will have, as last time, 2 hours. I will probably send you the exam around 1:25 or so.
Unless there are those with like, sorry, I was just gonna say, unless there are those with like special like accommodations.
Yes,
for like
of course.
extra time.
Yes. Anyone who we've agreed otherwise for extension of the time will repeat that in exactly the same form as before. If you have any questions on that, let me know. A couple of people have wanted to, I don't see Sabine here. She wanted to, maybe she's here. No, I don't see her yet. Some people wanted to discuss some aspects of their exams. If you want to do that, I'll be hanging around. And we can do that one-on-one, and I can bring up your exam and we can look through it a little bit if you want to after this session. Or we can do it tomorrow. So I hope the document I sent was helpful. Was it a bit helpful? Give you some context on the Aeneid, some questions to focus on. Today I just wanted to, answer your, maybe we'll go through it a little bit. I'll say some extra things about the Aeneid just to, we can get our bearings, and answer questions and maybe talk about some of the more important events that happened in the first 3 books that you're supposed to read. Just to repeat, for those of you who were not able to get the Penguin edition by David West, there is only one other edition that I will accept, and that is the Fagles translation, which Sabine has dug up. I believe it's available online. If you don't have it, then let me know and I can send that to you. But that's the only other edition that I will accept quotations on the exam from. Okay? There's a reason for that. I won't explain. I won't go into detail. But I did find on the previous exam people quoting from all kinds of translations I've never seen or heard of, and that makes things very difficult for me. The editions, Omar, are either, they're both Penguin. Penguin has 2 different versions of the Aeneid that they publish. One is the one that you'll find in the bookstore, if there's a bookstore open, and its translator is David West. The other translation is by, I believe, Robert Fagles. So either, I'll type these in the chat. It's either the West or Fagles translations. No others. I wrote this, by the way, on the document that I sent to everyone, so there's no new information here. So how did you find, since you're the only one up on video today, Hassan, how did you find the Aeneid?
Oh, I found it a bit like and I'm not gonna beat around the bush. It's very similar to the Odyssey, not only with like locations, but also like situations and stuff like that, like scenarios. Like for example, I love how like in the very beginning when Juno she gets the god of the winds, Aeolus, to get rid of like Aeneas's fleet, but then Neptune, the god of the sea, comes out and like restores the sea the balance. I found it kind of a good parallel where, like, in this story, the god of the sea is actually helping out our hero, but in the Odyssey, Poseidon, the god of the sea, was trying to do everything he can to destroy the hero.
Mhm.
I found
Sure,
that like a
sure.
nice parallel.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I pointed out that passage for a reason, for a couple of reasons we'll talk about. In focusing, I mean, that's one of the main things about this course is focusing on development through time and comparison. And that's why I chose the Aeneid in particular to end the course with, because it's, in your first reading, you will find so many similarities and interconnections that you will probably see very little else. But we do have to spend a lot of time thinking about what are the differences. And I think when you read the Aeneid, it feels very different. It has a different style. It has different key ideas. The hero is a completely different person in his commitments, in his actions, in his words, in his desires, and so on. His task is completely different. And yet it's set supposedly in the exact same time period as Odysseus is returning, right? So it's got this really nice parallelism that just as Odysseus has finished sacking Troy and is trying to return home and is sailing all over the Mediterranean and running into all of these monsters, somewhere not so far in that same sea is Aeneas running into many of the same monsters and vortices and mythical beings and having his own troubles on a different path, right? Because Odysseus is trying to get back home to his family, whereas Aeneas is fleeing towards the future, right? Away from the past to found something new that he doesn't even want to be involved in, right? We see this throughout the text. I hope you've noticed that Aeneas would rather have died at Troy than do any of the things that he ends up doing. He's a reluctant hero. Whereas Odysseus is returning for himself and his own glory, Aeneas is doing his duty to found a future empire that he will not be part of. Go ahead, Hassan, you had your hand up.
Yeah. I also like a little bit of the smaller similarities when you get down to brass tacks. Like, for example, the similarity between Odyssey and Aeneid with like the concept of burials. Because if you remember, one of Odysseus's men, I completely forgot the name of it. It's been a while. He really can't rest because his body wasn't properly buried. And the same thing happens in the extra credit book 6, when some of Aeneas's men, they can't really cross the river Styx because their bodies haven't been properly buried on Earth.
And he promises to go back and find them and bury them, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of them. There are actually two cases of this. Here you've hit on, there are a few places which I would almost call just straightforward theft. Right? I mean, although everybody obviously knew the Odyssey, so you can't really say it's theft. But I say it's theft in the sense that it's just a cute little thing that Virgil takes out of the Odyssey. It doesn't play any other role, I think, than saying, hey, look, this is just like the Odyssey, right? It's a little joke. I borrowed it, and I used it twice instead of just once. You see a number of those, I think. And that's one of the most obvious ones. Some things, maybe go back a little bit. So you see on your screen, I think, this is a bust of Virgil, right? Virgil, while you're reading this, of course, and I said this in the text I sent, you have to keep in mind that the Odyssey, right, was written, what was its context? It was written in reality, by numberless unknown people who preceded Homer and developed the story. And it was eventually written down, and it had its purpose in being repeated during festivals and feasts. And it had no particular, for instance, political purpose. It was not composed with an agenda or an ideology behind it. It simply was an expression of what the Greeks found cool and interesting and important, right? That's essentially all the Odyssey is an accumulation of the imagination of the Greeks and an expression of their thinking on many things, right? And for the most part, I mean, just as likely the lifestyle depicted in the Odyssey doesn't reflect the time of the Trojan War, it depicts the time in which Homer wrote it, right? A couple hundred years after the Trojan War. So also the Aeneid doesn't reflect either the time of the Trojan War, historically, nor the time of Odysseus, nor the time of Homer. Virgil didn't try to recreate historically the time of Homer. So everything in the Aeneid is, in fact, although it's historically placed 800 years earlier, is written as if it were composed by the imagination of the Romans, right, around the year 0. So in perhaps a little before the year 0, so 1st century BCE. And the world was completely different, as I said in the document that I sent. This is a world where Virgil here is living in, and I have a nice little map. Let me find the map. If you look at this, the color coding down here is the territory of Rome, and in the year 31 BC, right? And then between 31 and 19, you see the extensions, the green parts, and then the further extensions. The pink was added at the very end during the time Virgil was alive, by Emperor Augustus or Octavian, right? So if you look at this map, this is quite a different. Think of an empire that rules all of this landmass, the Roman Empire, which includes, of course, all the areas of Egypt we talked about. And think about the difference between the Odyssey, which really only encompasses this small part of the area here, right? This is where all the Odyssey takes place. And in the time of Virgil, he lives in the Roman Empire, which rules and has conquered all of this area. The difference between those cannot be understated, right? Or cannot be overstated. The difference between a small land area, generally with no common ties between cities, with small kings. Each king ruled his own city, just like Odysseus did, right? Is maybe an island, nothing more than that. They were all constantly at war with each other. And then suddenly, instead, you have, at the time of Virgil, a single empire ruling all of what they considered the known world, one leader of all of that, and all of his responsibilities. Think of how difficult it would be to rule and to maintain rule. So suddenly, someone like Odysseus, instead of thinking about adding to his own flocks of sheep, his concern is how can he keep the loyalty of a general that he has sent to Britannia, right? And how to motivate that fellow to be loyal to him, to, if he conquers, part of Germany, not to say this is my new kingdom, but to retain allegiance, right? So the intricacies and the bureaucracy and the just the different kinds of morals and virtues that we find in Virgil's time is an utter transformation. And you should look for that in the Aeneid itself. So looking at this map a little bit, you can see a couple other things. So this was Virgil, of course. This is during the time that he wrote the Aeneid. The emperor was Augustus. So Caesar was already dead, right? This is a future emperor. It's important that at the time of Augustus, there was a feeling. Have I lost Hassan? Have I lost everyone? No. Okay.
No.
Okay. At the time of Augustus, the Roman Empire was already quite an old empire. They had started back in the time of Homer. There were early kings, but they were just small, unknown tribes living and fighting with each other. Until eventually in the 300s BC, so around the time of Socrates and Plato, you had some substantial, a kingdom of around Rome in this area called Latium developing, a small kingdom, right? So there was a series of kings. Then Rome changed and got rid of kings. This was very central to their identity, was that they were no longer a kingdom, or in the Greek language, a tyranny, right? Remember Oedipus Tyrannus. A king was essentially a tyrant, person with absolute control. The Romans had overcome that, and they had established what was called a republic. This issue of being a republic was essential to being a Roman, right? They could have the pride that they no longer stood under kings. And they always thought in their political lives during the Roman Republic that the danger, the single most important danger to avoid, was falling back into a tyranny under a king. So the Republic, what did the Republic consist of? It consisted of establishing a Senate. A Senate, you had one ruler, right? Like an emperor, but not an emperor. They were called consuls. There were often 2 or 3 consuls that shared different parts of the political power, but they were balanced by a Senate of hundreds of wealthy land-owning Romans, some of which represented the working peasant class in the city of Rome, and fought for power, right? They had a Senate, so they debated issues, they passed laws. Almost all legal systems in Europe and so on are built upon the idea of the Roman legal system. You don't just have one guy who decides what is going to happen. You have sets of laws that have to be passed and that limit each other's power. In those laws are laws that limit the power of the consuls. The consuls have to give up their power every few years. There's a regular changing of the consuls. Senators also. That can be for a life term, but nevertheless, there has to be a certain the various offices they hold. They only hold for certain periods of time. This political structure of the Republic is also the religious structure of the Roman Empire as well, because the consuls are the head priests. So you have to think this is in a political system where, just like in a certain sense, just like Oedipus, though it's very, very different in every other respect, the king is a religious figure, right? For the Romans, they divided up the different roles of priests among the political class. That's very strange to us, and it's very easy for us to kind of misidentify the Roman emperors and so on as simply kind of secular figures, but they weren't. They were also held religious offices at the same time. Those were religious offices and bureaucratic and political offices, right? This is what made the Republic, right? These limitations of powers. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of Julius Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
What happened? Tell me, Hassan, what you know about Julius Caesar.
Well, what happened with Julius Caesar? He was like one of the rulers of Rome, and and basically what happened was he had around 30-ish or 25-ish group of conspirators that didn't like his methods, and then proceeded to stab him multiple times, leading to the famous line "Et tu, Brute" in the Shakespeare play, which I had to read last semester for class.
Yes, so many of you may know something about the assassination of Caesar. I'll say something about that in a minute, but the significance of Caesar was that he at various times was a consul and a politician in Rome. But most of all, he was a general. He was an incredibly successful general. And so essentially what you would do, if you weren't consul, but you were one of these leaders and you wanted something important to do, you would go off and try to expand the empire. That was essentially your pastime. You would march armies of tens of thousands of men into Germany and destroy the barbarians there and lay down roads and so on. And in doing so, you would build a kind of relationship with your armies, right? Over time, you built up the loyalty of these armies. And those men wanted to be led by Caesar, because if they were led by Caesar, they would, first of all, not lose. They would have victory and glory, but they would also be paid well. Their families would be taken care of. The state paid the soldiers. And who made sure the state paid the soldiers? The generals, right, who were responsible for the men. And the men looked to the general for leadership, but also not to get them killed and to make the right decisions and so on. And so there was an inherent intrinsic danger in this aspect of the Roman Empire, because a general could go off and suddenly gain the confidence of a huge portion of the Roman army for themselves. And those men might have greater allegiance to, say, Caesar than they would have to the present consul or republic. They might disagree with those people with certain decisions that have been made. And this was what people feared. Caesar was such a successful general, his men loved him so much, that they had a rule, in fact, that when generals entered Rome, they crossed a river called the Rubicon. And when they crossed the Rubicon, they had to lay down their power as generals. They were not allowed to re-enter Rome while still being a general, because the fear was they would re-enter Rome and there would be a coup. They would use the army to take control and become a new dictator, a king, which is what everyone feared. Right? That was, as I said, the great evil that they constantly spoke against in the Senate and so on. The expansion of the power of the generals and the dangers that it set for the Republic. Yes, Hassan?
I actually also want to mention something that I've noticed throughout many of the stories that we've read. There are a lot of instances where in stories from Rome and Greece, like the story of Julius Caesar and Oedipus, for example, they use the concepts of soothsayers and fortune tellers to predict the future, like beware the eyes of March or Oedipus, the killer is you or whatever, but they never really taken seriously, which is it's literally just a slap in the face of irony. It's just like, oh, I'm a fortune teller, I'm about to spoil the story. It's just like, nah, you don't know nothing. Yeah, know nothing, right?
So I mean, and we'll see. I'll say something about that. How of course the Romans still have this idea of as you say, seers and so on, and particularly of signs, like cosmic signs, meteor,
bolt of lightning, thunder, birds, so on. Theirs are a bit different though. And we'll see what they're more like. In any case, going back to the issue of Caesar, I read in the contextual source that at the time of Augustus there was a civil war. Okay, well during Caesar there was a civil war, and maybe early on there were issues about civil war with Augustus, but Augustus is known as having the longest peaceful reign and successful reign of pretty much any Roman emperor, right? After him, things really went downhill, and before him was Caesar. So, so what happened with Caesar? Well, Caesar did exactly what you would expect. Everyone loved him. Everyone feared him. They feared that he would become a new king. And at some point, that's what he decided to do. After he had gained enough power, he crossed the Rubicon with his own military. He did not lay down his power, and he took control of the Roman Empire. And then this led to all of these, to a civil war, right? Those who were in power then fled, and he had to track them down and either kill them or force them to commit suicide. So there's plenty of these stories out there, right? And he succeeded. He took power in Rome.
He kept the Senate, but he continually passed laws that gave him more and more power. He made himself be crowned emperor. This to many people meant we now have a new king, Julius Caesar. This is why, as Hassan said, a number of people who were regarded as allies of Julius Caesar banded together and decided, for the sake of the Roman Empire, they had to kill him. He was too successful, right? And this was not that strange. I mean, if you go back to Greek history, similar things happened. The great generals were often exiled from the city because people just thought, you cannot have a democracy where one man is so talented and so powerful that he kind of defeats the system and takes control, even though it is nominally a democracy. Now here, not only did he have control because he was so talented, but he used those talents to pass laws to increase his own power and to increasingly take on the role of a king, to have him praised. And part of that was he made himself be praised as a god. This was too much, right? And so, as you know, Shakespeare wrote a version, a play, Julius Caesar, in which he of course not as exactly as it happened, it's a dramatization, but of the murder of Caesar. And one of the key things in it is Brutus, which was considered one of his best friends, was part of the plot to kill him. You say, why would his friend plot to kill him? Because Brutus thought he was a patriot, right? The danger that Caesar posed to the Roman Empire was greater and more important than their friendship. So it seems like betrayal, but there was many people regarded, even later, those who murdered Caesar as true kind of patriots for the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic never truly returned after that. This is where you have the emperors. Rome didn't always have emperors. Originally it had kings, then it had a republic, but then eventually after Julius Caesar, it turned into emperors, right? The problem with emperors is, like kings, they are tyrants. Many of them were horrendously immoral. They fought for power, they murdered people, they did all kinds of, it's fun reading, but it's very bad when you live under these kinds of people. Nero and others, they're thought of as evil. They would poison their opponents, have them murdered, their own families. When power became a struggle within families, everybody was killing their brothers and sisters to keep them. You can essentially watch, some of you have probably seen Gladiator, what's his name, the fictional
Maximus.
He's named, I mean, there was an actual emperor with that name that had some of his features. He's modeled after a historical figure. After Augustus, almost all the emperors were like that. This is why when you look at the history of the emperors after Augustus Caesar, many of them rule for only a year or two, or a few months, and eventually either commit suicide or are assassinated. This happens over and over again. So this is the future. In any case, the Aeneid, now what does this all have to do with the Aeneid? Well, the Aeneid is written in the time of Augustus Caesar, when they feel that the Romans need, Augustus needs a kind of ideological foundation to reestablish the morals and loyalty of Romans to this new form of a Roman Empire that is no longer a republic, right? He believes that Rome is decaying and needs a kind of a morale boost. Well, what do? In most countries, they create propaganda, right? In this respect, the Aeneid is a kind of propaganda. And what does it do? It goes back and it retells the origins of Rome in a completely fictional way, right? It integrates with, there was already in existence a story of the founding of Rome. You've probably heard of the idea that there were these two boys who were abandoned, and there's some story about how they were abandoned. Their names were Romulus and Remus. They were raised by wolves. They grew up. They fought and Romulus killed Remus, and Romulus went on to found a city that later became Rome. And that's where Rome's name comes from the name of Romulus. That was an existing kind of a folk tale that the Romans had. And Virgil took that, and he took the Odyssey, and he decided to create a hero that would have true Roman virtues and would really express the essence of what a good Roman should be like, and make him not found Rome, because you can see this already reflected in a kind of moral outlook, right? The Romans have to live not just for themselves, it's not supposed to be selfish, but for the good of the empire, right? Sacrifice oneself for the good of the empire. And that's what Aeneas does, right? He doesn't live for himself, he lives for this future empire. And when, if you read The Underworld, you'll see there at the end, there's a whole series of future Roman heroes that are seen from the future history that I've told you about, right?
Right.
Including the child of Augustus Caesar. Virgil was very clever and wrote in the part there about the son of Augustus Caesar, and supposedly it was read to Augustus Caesar and his wife cried because their child died very young. And Virgil talks about in The Underworld this great future leader who unfortunately dies too young. And had he not died, he would have gone on to lead the Roman Empire to its greatest glory, right? So there's many things in the Aeneid that are looking to the future. The whole thing is looking to the future. And what is that future? It's this future Roman Republic and then the empire that is now in existence. So this is a statue of Augustus Caesar. A couple more little things here. I said the Aeneid in this respect is a kind of propaganda. If you look at your screen now, you can see, what is this? This is a coin. Can you see what it depicts on this coin? Anyone in the, not Hassan, anyone in the chat? Can you see what, it's a funny little picture, I know, but what do you think it's depicting?
What I see is basically, I'm going to be completely off when I say this, but what I see is somebody who in one hand is holding a little bit of a statue that looks like a soldier, and the other hand has like an owl-looking thing with like a human head.
So this is Aeneas, correct? If I show you another picture, you might have some idea here. Yes. So when Troy is sacked, is there another version? No, I don't believe so. When Troy was sacked, and this is the part of the cleverness, right? Virgil came up with this idea that he would make the Romans the descendants of the Trojans, right? So Aeneas is a hero who lives in Troy, and when Troy is sacked by the Greeks, he flees. When he flees, why does he flee? He wants to stay there and die, as you probably read. In the sacking of Troy, he several times is in anguish about whether to go down with all of his friends gloriously in the battle, because he's completely hopeless. If you read that, you'll notice he's hopeless. He sees the gods themselves tearing up the roots of Troy and sitting on the walls watching its destruction and urging it on, right? So he knows not only does he have no hope to win, but the gods are not on his side. And he wants to die there, but he is told that it is his duty to leave and to found this new city, right? And what does he do as a good Roman? He takes his family, right? Mm-hmm. He takes his father on his back. This is not an owl, but his father on his back. This is showing his responsibility, right, for other people.
Right.
Sacrifice. He doesn't want to do this. He wants to go out and die gloriously, but he's going to take on this burden and carry it with him. And on this, it is a little statue. These are the gods of the city, right? Again, duty. loyalty to the gods, the gods that are particularly the religion of his own people, right? So part of this is fusing, you can see together, political loyalty, religious loyalty, duty, and what is it on? It's on a coin. If you look at most coins from the ancient world, they have some leader, right? They have Caesar on them. They have Nero on them. Think of during the time of Augustus Caesar had the idea, no, don't put me on the coin. Put Aeneas, our new Roman hero, right? You don't put things on coins that aren't propaganda. That's what they intrinsically are, right? A symbol of what people should look to and respect. If you look at your own coins and bills, it's going to be great figures in Lebanese history or events or something like this, right? So this, I think, is a really great example to show you the kind of role. You would never have found Odysseus on a coin in the Greek world, right? It wouldn't make any sense because that's not the role that Odysseus played and the Odyssey played. Didn't play a political, ideological role. So keep this in mind. And you should, I say all of this not simply as background, but as you're actually reading the text, you will see this reflected. Here's just a little map of Aeneas. You saw, if we looked at the map of Odysseus's travels, it would be very similar, right? Except this issue of going to Carthage and ending up in Latium, right? So this is his path in the story. Essentially, the story is much simpler than the Odyssey, right? To let you know what happens in the parts you don't read, in the beginning, the first book, right, we have Aeneas at sea and his landing here near Carthage. He tells the story to Dido. He meets Queen Dido, and he tells her the story of his wanderings so the wanderings are very much like Odysseus' wanderings, and the sacking of Troy. Then they proceed to Sicily, where his father dies, right? And they have games to commemorate that, and they continue then on. And this, so all of this happens before the book even starts, right? These are the wanderings. And like he lands in Italy, and essentially all of that part in Italy is, well, of course, he lands in Italy, and there are already local tribes and kings. And so to found a new city, he has to find and take over one of these small kingdoms and marry the queen of that kingdom. And this brings him into conflict with the local peoples. And so there are various tribes, he fights them. There's a back and forth. The gods determine eventually that he is going to found Rome, though. And so this ends up in a final battle with a man named Turnus, right? Eventually, if he kills Turnus, then he will marry Turnus's wife and become the king of that local city. That city is not going to be Rome. Eventually, in the future, after Aeneas dies, his son, Ascanius, who is key here, because his son Ascanius will be the one to found the city that will eventually become Rome. So that's why he takes his son with him. His son is always this symbol of the future throughout the book. So the rest of the book is just these battles back and forth, these extremely violent battles that end with the killing of Turnus. And in many ways, it's like a 200-page version of the killing of the suitors, right? Very extended description of battles in which the gods are constantly in control, although Aeneas doesn't know that. And there are various episodes where the gods make decisions to prevent so-and-so from getting killed, and eventually Turnus dies. This is some depiction here, a painting, I believe I have. This is Aeneas meeting Dido. We'll talk about Dido. This is I always like this picture. This is like a 17th century, 18th century depiction of Aeneas killing Turnus. It's a very odd picture, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's like Turnus is sitting there and he just goes like this.
Yeah.
And his head falls.
It's just like, take that.
That's not how it's described in the book. This is kind of a very strange picture, but I would encourage anyone to finish it. It's quite remarkable to read, and
But we
it's
only have to
really like a
focus on.
puppet show, though.
Right.
It's really like a puppet show. The gods control every bit of the action and determine when it's time for Turnus to die. And there's a lot of like chasing and running around, and one minor god who is like the related to Turnus, this minor female god, tries to keep him alive as long as possible, and then eventually even she is told by the gods she must abandon him, and that's when he dies. What did you want to say, Hassan?
All right. You were mentioning about like the recommendation to reading all of the like Aeneid, because it's like a pretty good like book. But I quickly interjected to say, but we only have to focus on 1, 2, 4, and 6 for extra credit.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So what to look at in those? A few, just one other thing. I'm sure you all know that Virgil. This is the great work of the Roman literature. Virgil actually, when he died, asked that it be burned and destroyed, but Augustus and others wouldn't let that happen. And he went on to play another role, you may know, in Dante. Dante's Inferno. Virgil is the poet who leads him through the underworld. Leads the main character of the Inferno through the underworld and shows him. The underworld, for those of you who read the extra credit chapter, the underworld is fascinatingly complex. And so there are many things that Dante takes from that. The fact that it's kind of divided into different areas, that there is this is the first time in the history of literature that you find, more or less, there's one small exception, that you find something like a heaven and a hell, right? If you've ever heard of like this, the fields of Elysium, where the heroes ride horses and do mock battles and things, this is from the Aeneid. There's a good place where they go, and there's bad places that are kind of suited to the moral failings of people. So people who commit suicide go to a certain place. Those who were politically traitors to the Roman Republic go to a certain place, and so on and so forth. And they have punishments fitting their lives, the lives that they led. Of course, you can see this makes sense suddenly, because that didn't make sense in if you think of the idea of an afterlife as motivating a kind of life you would lead, right? Like, if you think that people who commit suicide are tortured eternally in some place in the underworld, then that's going to motivate you not to kill yourself, right? So that the idea of an afterlife and how it's structured and depicted is related to backing up and giving an ideology for certain ways of acting in our lives, right? God rewards you, so do the things that would get you rewards, and so on. But the underworlds in the Gilgamesh and in the Odyssey had no such function. They didn't believe in those kinds of things. It just wasn't part of their. So you can see that makes sense that their underworlds just didn't have this kind of structure. But in the time of Augustus, they really wanted to motivate people to act in certain ways and not in other ways, right? And you will see that. Of course, if you compare that with Dante's Inferno, the further differences come from Christianity. Because there's certain things that the Romans thought was great, that the Christians thought was wrong and bad, and so those will be treated differently in their different versions of the underworld, right?
I mean, quick thing.
Sure.
I actually, if I remember correctly, one of the things in Dante's Inferno is that in every different circle of hell that they go through, certain type of people who do certain types of crimes end up there. Like ones for like murder, one's for like gluttony, blah blah blah. And I feel like that could be a bit of a comparison to the Aeneid, when in the extra credit chapter, the chapter book 6, when they make it to the underworld, there are certain sections of the underworld that are for certain types of deaths. Like there's one for tragic deaths, from suicides, infants, yada yada yada, and other places.
Exactly what I was saying. Exactly
Okay.
what I was saying. It's much more developed, of course. You could say in Christianity, the idea of using the afterlife as a kind of motivational tool, a kind of, I mean, I guess it's the best way to say it, as a kind
Yeah.
of story to motivate you to act in certain ways and not to act in others, is kind of fully developed. It's just, we
Right.
see it in its beginnings in the Aeneid. And of course, it's going to be related to the kinds of virtues that Virgil wanted to support, right? It's those great generals that, interestingly, it's not the pure of heart or anything like in Christianity that would be in the best place in Virgil's underworld. It's the great generals, the people who are loyal to their country and lead the men great and so on, right? You don't see that in Christianity. It's not great generals who go to heaven and everybody else find some other place to go. So also this means that unlike the Christian afterlife and heaven and hell, Virgil's is very politically related, right? Reflects the political structure of the time more than anything else. And so there are people, all the people that he talks about are, this will be the future leader and the future emperor and so on and so forth. Okay, shall we look at that document I sent?
Is it the one that has like a bunch of notes?
Yeah, are there some questions there anyone wants to talk about?
Actually, I have a question relating to like the final. In the midterm, you gave us, like, for the second essay, you gave us the option to like make up our own question and follow that up with a response. Well, will the same thing happen?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Leaving us in the dark. Okay.
It's unlikely, I'll tell you that. Because that allows a great deal of, it's very, very much easier to plagiarize, for instance, when that happens. Amazingly, only one or two people made up their own question. Almost everyone chose the question that I gave them, which was slightly disappointing, but it makes me wonder if I should give any students seem to like the choice, but they're given the choice, they're afraid maybe to take a risk. But I would say taking a risk is, you should do it, right? It certainly is, there is no safety involved in these questions. If you take the safe route, you've kind of set yourself a low bar. Anyways, let's see. Shall we talk about? So, in the chat, I like some people to comment here. So, what are some things that you noticed in your reading that would not, or that kind of shows that this? Okay, well here let's make this very simple. Let's compare Aeneas and Odysseus. What are the major differences between Aeneas and Odysseus? And how, more importantly, how do you see those differences? What's the textual basis that leads you to think they're different in these ways?
Well, for one, one difference is that whilst Odysseus is already the king of his own kingdom of Ithaca, and he has his own quest to get back to Ithaca and get revenge, for Aeneas, he is as Sabine is saying, is driven by duty, as well as he has a quest to help start the bloodline to find Rome. And he's not really a king of anything. He's just like most likely a soldier.
Yeah. Sabine. So Sabine, yeah, that's the starting point, right? He's driven by duty, Odysseus by glory and vengeance. We kind of see the only time we really see vengeance in the Aeneid is the killing of Turnus, and it's not even vengeance for Aeneas himself. Aeneas doesn't want to kill Turnus. Turnus is like his great, respected adversary. And he, at the end, Aeneas takes a moment and he is going to spare the life of Turnus. But then he sees that Turnus is wearing a belt that Turnus took when he killed Aeneas's friend, Pallas. And he decides to kill him, right? He kills him out of the sadness and the memory of his friend that was killed. So even that is not vengeance in the sense of Odysseus, right? Vengeance in Odysseus was for his own sake. You've dishonored me and you've broken these rules against me. I cannot allow that. Aeneas for himself doesn't want to kill Turnus, but it's because of his responsibility for someone else, this young friend of his who died, right? He reluctantly kills Turnus. So everything Aeneas does is reluctant, meaning he does it out of a sense of duty, loyalty, and so on. Does he want to leave Dido? He has a pretty good time with Dido, right?
Yeah, but at that time, you got to remember she was being controlled by like Cupid.
Sure. Yes.
And
Cupid disguised himself as Ascanius,
mm-hmm.
Aeneas's son, and yes, as you say, shoots her with an arrow that causes her to fall madly in the true sense of mad, insanely in love with Aeneas. And she eventually kills herself, of course, in the most pitiful way you can imagine. But does he want to leave her?
Oh, sorry. I don't think, I don't know if maybe he wants to leave her. But what I do notice is that with Dido's clinginess towards Aeneas, you can kind of compare it to like the clinginess of a Calypso from Odyssey.
Yeah, it's much more violent, and it's
much more violent in Aeneas. Just
it's really an unfortunate story. But the point there, Asil says no, he doesn't want to. Even there, he doesn't want to continue to Rome. But he is told that it is his duty to do so. And we see that's a good example because he says he would rather stay. In fact, he tells Dido he would have rather died in Rome, in Troy, back when. None of this he's wanted to do. But even now, he doesn't want to continue. But as soon as he gets the message that he must, he never looks back, right? He immediately embarks without any thought. In fact, he doesn't even really think about the effect that it will have on Dido. He is surprised when he sees her dead in the underworld, right? And saddened to know, although they could see the smoke from her funeral pyre, because she builds a pyre and climbs on top of it. I mean, you couldn't think of a more pitiful ending, right? She has them build a pyre. She piles all the things that belong to him on top of it and the bed they slept together on. And she climbs on top of all of that and stabs herself, right? And no one knew that's what her plan was. Let's see, what else are differences? I'm going to state something and tell me what the textual evidence for this is in the chat as well. Or maybe I'll ask it. We pretty much know how Odysseus related to his own men. Right? He was the leader. Was he a good leader?
No.
We didn't see that so much. Yeah. it's hard to say he's a good leader when all of his men ended up dead.
Yeah, most of the screw ups come by when like he always acts like a leader, but most of the screw ups in his journey comes from his men just making one simple mistake, costing the lives of many of the men.
And his risks, the risks that he took with the Cyclops, he took the risk for the sake of the guest gifts and so on. The
cattle as well, and
any
they don't have to
cases
eat
of
the.
this, also with the what were they called? The Ciconians. The idea to stop and sack the Ciconians' land, although eventually his men were partially responsible for that. But doesn't seem like a wise leader who puts his men before himself. You never saw Odysseus put anyone before himself. So also you could see this in the Odyssey because can you name the men of Odysseus?
Some of them you could name, but others are like, faces.
Do you remember even seeing the names of his men? The only one I can think of is the joke of Elpenor.
Yeah.
I can't even think of seeing another man's name.
Mm-hmm.
Only the one who convinced to kill the sheep. Maybe, yeah. How about compare that to the Aeneid? Do we see do we know the names of the I mean, I'm not saying do you remember them. Are they mentioned? The names of
some of them are. Like, if I remember correctly, there was I'm gonna butcher this one. It's Achates, which is Aeneas' right hand, his right hand man.
Yeah.
And that's basically all I can remember at this point.
If you with that in mind, if you read the first book again, you'll notice that, for instance, when they're out on the sea, he's crying and naming each of the men in the ships that he sees go down. It says, and he mourned for great so-and-so, who da-da-da-da-da, right? Most of his men are named and are dwelt upon when they die. I mean, this, of course, maybe the greatest example of this is when he kills Turnus, and it's all about this young friend of his who died, right? He's doing it for other people. He cares for his men. When he lands on Carthage, there are two passages that would be wonderful to compare here. I don't have the other one at hand. When Odysseus they landed on the island of the Cyclopes. It said Odysseus went out and his men and they killed deer. And it said, and Odysseus took the largest one for himself. What do Achates and Aeneas do when they land in Africa near Carthage? They go out and they hunt for food for the other men. And we are not told he takes the largest for himself. In fact, it's clear that he's providing for his men, right? So it's completely different. Of course, along the way he meets, who does he meet? A goddess.
Oh, right, a goddess. Oh,
Venus, yes.
Oh,
how does Venus still relate to Aeneas?
If I remember, Venus is Aeneas's mother.
Mother, yes. This is the other odd thing about the Romans. The Greeks didn't tend to. It's like the Romans became much more self-important in a certain way, because the Greeks always talked about like being distantly related to gods, maybe, but the Romans would just say, "No, my father's a god." Even the emperors were gods, some of them, right? So there was this
just like Gilgamesh.
Yeah. So there's a bit of a going back to like Gilgamesh, exactly. But there's this kind of like divinity is much closer to human beings. Here, Venus is his mother. Yes, actually, his mother is a goddess, but he is in no way divine. So that's hard to explain. right? He can be killed just like any other man. He has no more favor, right, upon him. And Venus is, but the reason I mention this, because Venus is disguised as what? As a female hunter. Not as Athena was always disguised as a man or a boy. Right? And not just a female, but a female hunter. So women are very differently depicted. And I said this in the document, but that's one of the things to keep in mind. Let's see. So we're talking about
one of the reasons.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. I just was saying, like, I feel like one of the reasons why, whenever characters like Gilgamesh or Aeneas are mentioned to be like the sons of gods, I feel like the only reason why they had to be the sons of gods is because plot, just because, like, the plot has to happen.
Yeah. Sabine asks, is the Aeneid comparable to Gilgamesh in other aspects, though? I would expect very few. And I would guess that that similarity is from very different reasons. But though I haven't given it a great deal of thought, there doesn't really seem to be much contact between Gilgamesh and the Aeneid. We were talking about the differences. Also, I mean, well, the greatest character, the most prominent feature of Odysseus is his wisdom, right? His mind, his trickiness, his ability to tell incredible lies. Do we see anything like that reflected in the character of Aeneas? We see the exact opposite, right?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, we see Aeneas telling the story. So I agree, Sabine, in that unless you think a bit about it, you don't really see any connection, right? Like there's no, but there is one in the respect that Aeneas is, he tells the story of Sinon, right? Who was Sinon? Sinon was, so this is one of the primary, the Greek who tricked them, exactly. One of the key sources for the story of the Trojan horse, I told you it's not in the Iliad or the Odyssey, right? One of the key sources of it is this text, right? In this version. And here, it's known as the great trick of Ulysses, right? And it serves as a vehicle for Virgil, through Aeneas's mouth, to essentially, harp on how horrible Greeks are because they're such terrible liars and they cannot be trusted. Here, lying is unequivocally bad, dishonorable, despicable, hateful, dishonest. This we see for the first time. What does that mean? That means for Aeneas, telling the truth is a supreme virtue. Being honest, being reliable. And he puts it in this form, that they were able to be tricked by Sinon, this other Greek, and by the Trojan horse, because they never imagined that someone could be such a liar, right? And would take such advantage of their belief and trust in them. And so Sinon is this, say the Greek who tricked them, he is supposedly, according to this version of the Trojan horse, right? Odysseus comes up with the idea of them hiding inside of the Trojan horse, and the rest of the Greek army goes off and stays on an island nearby and waits for the Trojan horse to be taken inside and opened up so that the walls of Troy are open and they all flood in and sack Troy, right? But how are they going to get the Trojan horse into Troy? Well, they leave behind a man named Sinon, who tells this incredible lie about how Ulysses, Odysseus, was going to have him sacrificed. Because if you remember the story, Agamemnon sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, so that the winds would blow them in the direction of Troy originally. And so when the Greeks, according to Sinon, have given up, they're not going to sack Troy anymore, They've waited long enough and they can't take it. So they're all going to leave. And when they want to leave, the winds are not blowing in the right direction because they have to sacrifice someone to go back. And Sinon is selected because, and Odysseus, because he hates him for various personal reasons, gets it so that Sinon is pegged as the guy who's going to be sacrificed. So Sinon leaves the Greek army and hides. And the wind ends up changing, I guess, accidentally or something. And they leave without Sinon, and he's left behind. And so he tells the Trojans, if you take the horse into your city, he tells them that the Greeks built the horse to appease the gods. And if you take it into your city, this will turn the gods on your side, right? And if you just don't, and Sinon's a fantastic liar if you read it in detail, right? Because he plays on the sensibility of the Romans or the Trojans, right? He says things like, "Oh no, just go ahead and kill me. I know there's no honor in this world. No one thanks someone who helps them. You're just going to kill me anyway, so just go ahead and get it done." And they say, no, tell us. And then when he tells them, they essentially reward him and say, you can live with us for as long as you like, right? We will take care of you, those horrible Greeks, right? And then, of course, he goes inside with the Trojan horse and lets out the Greeks, and they kill. He double crosses So this whole story shows us an absolute difference between the outlooks of the Greeks and the Romans. And the Romans always thought of the Greeks as liars, dishonorable, can't be trusted, and so on. That was the image of the Greeks that the Romans had. Of course, that was a virtue for the Greeks. They thought of lying and trickery as a great power to have, right? And to master.
There was also this character, if I remember correctly, there was also this character known as Laocoon, who tried to tell people like, wait, no, the Trojan horse is a trick. You're gonna die if we bring it in. And then he just gets killed by two serpents, which everybody mistakes as, oh no, these are a sign that the goddess Minerva is angry with us, so we should take the Trojan horse inside.
Yeah, this is one of the most famous statues on the planet. It's actually a Roman reproduction of an earlier statue. This is Laocoon and his two sons, as Hassan says in the just after Sinon tells his lie. Laocoon is distrustful. He's the one Trojan who has second thoughts about this. He's also a priest, working there by the sea, and yes, the gods. Who is it? I forget exactly.
Minerva.
Which god Minerva sends the sea serpent. You can see the sea serpent here wrapping around their legs and arms, and kills Laocoon and his two sons. And as you say, they take this as a sign, because Laocoon throws a spear and it sticks in the wooden horse. And they take it that this injury he inflicts on the wooden horse is taken as an offense to the gods, and the gods punish him for it. But that's not exactly what it is. The gods plan to have Troy sacked, so this is another manipulation of the Trojans by the gods. This statue is extremely famous. In the 18th century, a man named Winkelmann and some others, there's a whole flurry of books and essays about this piece because it was discovered, and they used it as a kind of a example to discuss the theory of beauty and sculpture. So modern aesthetic theory, a lot of it was largely built on a book called Laocoon, and the discussion of Laocoon, particularly by German philosophers and others. So that's kind of a side note. They wondered why he doesn't look like he's in pain when he's supposedly being killed. And they argue that he's already dead here for various reasons. I guess, do we not have the 40-minute, obviously the
No.
40-minute thing isn't hitting us.
Yeah, it's already past like an hour and 10 minutes already.
All right, we should probably wrap up. Other things that you want to discuss, we could go on and on and on. But
What were you saying earlier about like the meetings talking about the midterms?
like Ali said, people who want to talk about the midterm, I think maybe we can do that later this evening or tomorrow. I would like to have dinner, I think that's
Right.
coming up here. Why don't those of you, I know Sabine wants to, I know Ali wants to, Hassan, you want to talk about
No,
it?
it's good.
Why, anyone who wants to discuss and essentially just look at your midterm and talk about it a little bit, send me just a quick email after this meeting and when you can do it, tonight or tomorrow, tomorrow in the afternoon, and then we'll just set it up. I don't have anything scheduled for this evening or tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. Is there anything, other questions?
I'm good.
Okay.
Right.
I don't see anything in the chat. So, okay, send me those emails. We'll wrap it up here then. Thanks
All right.
for, I don't guess I'll see you all anytime soon.
Sure.
Have a good summer.
You too.
And thanks for the class. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor.
All right. See you all later.
See ya.